You used to love being around people. Parties, gatherings, long dinners that stretched past midnight. You were the one who stayed, the one who listened, the one who made everyone feel welcome. And then something shifted. Slowly at first, then all at once. Now you're canceling plans you used to look forward to. You're leaving events early with some excuse about being tired. You're sitting in your car after work, dreading the idea of walking into a room full of people who want to talk about nothing. And the strangest part isn't that you've changed. The strangest part is that you don't feel sad about it. You feel relieved. Everyone around you thinks something's wrong. They say you've become distant, judgmental, maybe even cold. But that's not what's happening inside you. Inside, it feels more like someone finally turned down the volume on a sound you didn't realize had been deafening you for years. And now that it's quieter, you can hear yourself think for the first time. And what you're thinking is that most of the social interactions you've been participating in your entire life have been completely hollow. Jung spent years observing this pattern in patients who were undergoing genuine psychological transformation. He watched people who had been socially fluid, well-liked, deeply enmeshed in their communities, suddenly pull away. Their families panicked. Their friends got offended. Therapists sometimes misdiagnosed it as depression or antisocial tendencies. But Jung recognized something different was happening. These people weren't breaking down, they were breaking through. And part of that breakthrough meant they could no longer tolerate what they'd been tolerating their entire lives. Today I'm going to walk you through why spiritual awakening almost always produces this growing dislike of people, what Jung discovered about the psychological mechanisms driving it, why it's a sign of health rather than dysfunction, and what happens on the other side of this deeply uncomfortable phase that most people never talk about. The first thing to understand is that what you're experiencing as disliking people is actually something far more specific. You haven't suddenly become a misanthrope. You haven't lost your capacity for connection. What's happened is that your perception has shifted, and you're now registering something that was always there, but that you'd trained yourself to ignore. Jung would have called this the collapse of persona tolerance. The persona, in his framework, is the social mask, the curated version of ourselves that we present in public. Everyone wears one. Your boss has one. Your mother has one. You have one. And in normal social functioning, there's an unspoken agreement between people. I won't look behind your mask if you don't look behind mine. We'll interact mask to mask and call it connection. For most of your life, you participated in this agreement without questioning it. You laughed at jokes that weren't funny because the social contract required it. You asked, "How are you?" and accepted good as an answer, knowing full well it wasn't true. You sat through conversations where people performed versions of themselves that had almost nothing to do with who they actually were, and you performed right back. Everyone did. And it worked, in the sense that social life moved smoothly. Then awakening began doing what awakening does. It started dissolving your own persona. You began seeing through your own mask, recognizing the ways you'd been performing, noticing how much of your personality was constructed for other people's comfort rather than your own truth. And once you started seeing through your own performance, you couldn't stop seeing through everyone else's. This is the mechanism Jung identified. When someone begins the individuation process, his term for the journey towards psychological wholeness, their tolerance for inauthenticity drops dramatically. And it drops first in how they perceive others, often before they've fully dismantled their own false self. Which is why this phase feels so uncomfortable. You're suddenly allergic to something that everyone around you still considers normal. Think about what happens at a typical social gathering once this shift has occurred. You walk in, and within minutes you're reading the room differently than everyone else. You notice the couple performing happiness while radiating tension. You hear the friend telling a story they've told 40 times, polished to a shine, every detail designed to make them look a certain way. You watch people compete for attention while pretending they're just having conversation. You feel the desperate undercurrent of people trying to be liked, trying to be impressive, trying to be anything other than what they actually are in that moment. And the noise of it, the sheer volume of performance happening in every direction, becomes unbearable. You used to swim in this water without noticing it was water. Now you feel like you're drowning in it. Jung was fascinated by how consistently this pattern appeared. Patients in the midst of genuine transformation would describe social situations with a kind of horrified clarity. They'd say things like, "I can't sit through dinner with my friends anymore. Everything they say sounds like a script." Or, "My family gatherings feel like watching actors who've forgotten they're in a play." These patients weren't being arrogant. They were describing what it actually feels like when your perceptual filters change and you start registering the layer of reality that persona agreements are designed to hide. Here's where it gets psychologically interesting. The reason this shift produces something that feels like dislike, and sometimes genuinely becomes dislike, is that you're not just perceiving inauthenticity in others, you're perceiving the cost of it. You're seeing what the performance is covering up, what it's protecting people from facing, and what it's preventing in terms of real connection. And that recognition carries grief with it, and frustration, and sometimes anger. You sit across from someone you've known for 15 years and realize you have no idea who they actually are. Every interaction you've ever had has been mask to mask. The friendship you thought was deep was actually just two personas who were compatible. And now that your persona is dissolving, the compatibility is gone, because you're no longer the version of yourself that fit neatly into that dynamic. Jung described this as one of the most painful aspects of individuation. The people in your life didn't choose the real you, they chose your persona. And as you shed that persona, you discover which relationships were built on genuine connection and which were built on the convenient fiction of who you both pretended to be. Most fall into the second category, and watching that become clear is a specific kind of loneliness that people who haven't been through this process can't really understand. But there's a deeper layer to this dislike that goes beyond persona perception, and Jung was careful to document it because it's the part that makes people feel the most guilty. As awakening progresses, you don't just lose tolerance for other people's masks, you lose tolerance for their unconsciousness. And that's a harder thing to admit because it sounds like arrogance. It sounds like you think you're better than everyone. But that's a misread of what's actually happening. What's happening is that you've started doing the brutal internal work of facing your own shadow, the parts of yourself you spent decades denying, the wounds you've been running from, the patterns you inherited and never questioned. You've been sitting with the ugliest parts of your psyche and trying to integrate them rather than project them. And this work has cost you. It's cost you comfort, certainty, relationships, sometimes your sense of identity altogether. So when you encounter people who are not only avoiding this work, but who are actively building more elaborate defenses against ever having to do it, people who are doubling down on their personas, their distractions, their comfortable lies about who they are and what they want, something in you recoils. You're watching people invest tremendous energy into staying asleep, and you can't relate to it anymore because you know what that sleep costs. You've been paying the price of it your whole life, and you've decided to stop. Jung was very specific about what this looks like psychologically. He said that a person undergoing individuation develops what he called a sensitivity to unconsciousness, an almost physical reaction to being around people who are deeply identified with their false selves. The reaction isn't intellectual. It's somatic. You feel it in your body. The tightness in your chest during small talk. The exhaustion after spending an hour with someone who's performing their entire personality. The strange nausea that comes from being in environments where everyone is pretending and no one is acknowledging it. This sensitivity isn't pathology. It's your psyche's way of telling you that the environments and relationships that were built for your old self are incompatible with who you're becoming. The discomfort is information. And Jung would tell you to listen to it rather than override it with guilt about being judgmental. Because that's exactly what most people do at this stage. They feel the dislike rising and immediately turn it against themselves. I shouldn't feel this way. I should be more compassionate. I should be able to love people where they are. What's wrong with me that I can't just enjoy a dinner party anymore? This self-attack is the old programming fighting to maintain the social contract you're breaking. It's the persona's last defense, convincing you that your authentic reaction is a character flaw rather than a sign of growth. Jung observed that patients who listened to the guilt instead of the discomfort often regressed. They'd force themselves back into social patterns that no longer fit, re-adopt persona behaviors they'd been shedding, and essentially abandon their individuation to preserve relationships that couldn't survive their transformation. And the cost of that regression was always depression, a bone-deep depression that came from betraying their own emerging truth to keep other people comfortable. The patients who trusted the discomfort, who allowed themselves to feel the dislike without judging themselves for it, who gave themselves permission to withdraw from social situations that felt hollow, those were the patients who made it through to the other side. But let's be honest about something Jung was honest about. Part of what you're feeling during this phase is your own shadow, and if you skip this part, you'll get stuck. Some of the dislike you feel toward others is genuine perception. You really are seeing through masks you couldn't see through before. You really are registering inauthenticity that used to be invisible to you. That's real, and it's healthy. But some of what you're feeling is projection. You're seeing in others the parts of yourself you're in the process of rejecting. The performer, the people pleaser, the one who smiled when they wanted to scream, the one who traded authenticity for belonging. Jung was adamant that awakening without shadow work becomes spiritual superiority. If you're looking at the people around you with nothing but contempt, if your dislike has no grief in it, no recognition that you were exactly where they are not long ago, no compassion for how terrifying it is to live without your masks, then you haven't actually awakened. You've just built a new persona. The awakened one, who's above it all. And that persona is more toxic than the one it replaced because it's convinced of its own enlightenment. Real awakening carries a paradox. You see people's unconsciousness clearly, and you feel genuine compassion for it, and you still can't be around it for extended periods without it costing you something essential. All three of those things can be true simultaneously. The seeing, the compassion, and the need for distance, they coexist. And holding that paradox without collapsing it into either contempt or self-sacrifice is one of the hardest psychological tasks of the entire individuation process. This is where the work lives, right here in this tension, because you've been given two false options by everything you've ever been taught. Option 1. Be loving and accepting and tolerate everyone, which means abandoning your own growth to maintain social harmony. Option 2. Become the cold, detached, too evolved for ordinary people archetype, which means using awakening as armor against intimacy. Jung would reject both of these. He'd tell you there's a third option, and it's more demanding than either of the easy ones. If you've been sitting with this tension, the pull between who you're becoming and the social world that doesn't fit anymore, you might find something useful in our guide, True Self-Discovery. It's built around 24 reflection exercises drawn from Jung's teachings, and several of them deal specifically with what happens when inner transformation puts you at odds with the people and patterns you used to call home. Click below if that speaks to where you are. The third option Jung described is what he called conscious withdrawal with integrated compassion, which sounds clinical when stated that way, but in practice it looks like this. You reduce your social world deliberately and without apology. You stop attending events that feel hollow. You let go of friendships that exist only at the persona level. You stop forcing yourself to enjoy interactions that drain you. You withdraw from the noise. And you do all of this while maintaining awareness that the people you're withdrawing from aren't bad or lesser or beneath you. They're at a different place in their process. You were at that place too for a long time. Some of them will begin their own awakening eventually. And when they do, they'll need the same space and patience you need right now. This is the compassion part. And it's what separates genuine individuation from spiritual narcissism. You can leave the party without despising the people who are still there. You can refuse to engage in surface-level conversation without concluding that the people having it are worthless. You can honor your own transformation without turning it into a hierarchy where you're at the top. Jung found that the people who navigated this phase well shared a specific quality. They were willing to be misunderstood. They accepted that pulling away would look like rejection to the people they were pulling away from. They accepted that choosing solitude would be interpreted as coldness, that setting boundaries would be called selfishness, that their transformation would be pathologized by people who had no framework for understanding it. And they let those interpretations exist without trying to correct them. Because here's the truth Jung discovered about trying to explain your awakening to people who haven't had one. It doesn't work. You cannot describe a perceptual shift to someone who hasn't experienced it. Telling someone who's deeply identified with their persona that you can see through personas is like telling a fish about air. The concept doesn't land because they have no experiential reference point for it. And your attempts to explain will either make you sound crazy or make them feel judged, usually both. So you learn silence. You learn to hold your perception without announcing it. You learn that your changed relationship to people doesn't require anyone else's understanding or approval. And this silence, this willingness to be privately transformed without publicly performing your transformation, is itself a massive part of the growth. Jung noticed that patients who needed everyone to understand their awakening were still operating from persona. They were performing awakened person for an audience, seeking validation for their transformation, which meant the transformation hadn't actually completed. The people who had genuinely individuated were quieter about it. They didn't announce their discomfort with social situations. They just stopped showing up to the ones that drained them. They didn't lecture friends about inauthenticity. They just naturally gravitated toward the few people who were capable of real exchange. Let's talk about what happens to your social world once this withdrawal is underway, because this is where people get scared. Your circle shrinks, dramatically. Friendships you maintained for years, sometimes decades, dissolve without a dramatic ending. You just stop reaching out. They stop reaching out. The connection that was held together by mutual persona performance can't survive once one person drops the act. And you watch these relationships fade with a strange mix of sadness and relief. Sadness because history matters, because shared experience matters, because you genuinely cared about these people even if the connection was surface level. Relief because maintaining those connections was costing you energy you didn't realize you were spending until you stopped spending it. Jung described this shrinking as essential. He compared it to a tree being pruned. The removal of branches that are no longer alive allows the remaining branches to grow stronger and in the direction they're meant to grow. Your social pruning follows the same principle. The relationships that fall away were consuming resources that your psyche needs for the transformation it's undergoing. And the relationships that survive the pruning, the ones that can handle the real you, the unmasked you, the sometimes difficult and unpredictable you, those are the ones that will become the foundation of whatever comes next. But here's the part that most spiritual content glosses over. The pruning period is lonely. Genuinely, achingly lonely. Because the old connections are gone or fading, and the new ones haven't formed yet. You're in a social no man's land where you don't fit with the people you used to know, and you haven't yet found the people who can meet you where you are. And this loneliness has a specific texture to it. It's not the loneliness of having no one around. It's the loneliness of being surrounded by people who can't see you, who are relating to a version of you that no longer exists, who are confused by what you've become and want the old you back. Jung found that this loneliness, while brutal, served a psychological function. It forced the individuating person to develop a relationship with themselves that didn't depend on external validation. When you can't get mirroring from your social world, when no one around you reflects back who you're becoming, you have to find that reflection internally. You have to become your own witness, your own validator, your own companion through the transformation. This is individuation in its purest form. Becoming whole unto yourself, learning that your sense of identity doesn't require consensus, that your perception is valid even when no one else shares it, that you can trust your own experience of reality without needing a crowd to confirm it. And the loneliness of the pruning phase is what builds this capacity. You couldn't develop internal authority while you were still outsourcing your sense of self to your social world. There's another dimension to this disliking people phenomenon that Jung explored, and it has to do with energy. Before awakening, most people are unconscious about how social interaction affects their energy. They don't notice the subtle drain of spending 2 hours with someone who's performing anxiety. They don't register the heaviness that comes from absorbing a room full of unacknowledged tension. They're running on autopilot, socially speaking, and the energy costs are invisible because they've never known anything different. Awakening changes your sensitivity to these energy dynamics the same way it changes your perception of persona. You start feeling the actual impact of every interaction. The friend who complains for an hour without ever wanting solutions. You feel the drain in real time now. The family member who creates chaos wherever they go. You notice how your body tenses within minutes of their arrival. The coworker who performs cheerfulness while radiating resentment. You pick up the dissonance and it exhausts you in a way you can't quite articulate. This heightened sensitivity to social energy isn't you being dramatic or oversensitive. Jung recognized it as a natural consequence of expanded awareness. When you become more conscious of your own internal states, which is what shadow work and individuation require, you also become more conscious of everyone else's. You're no longer buffered by the thick padding of your own unconsciousness. You're walking around with fewer psychological defenses, which means you're more exposed to the psychological weather of every room you enter. So of course you want to be around fewer people. Of course you're selective about who gets access to your time and space. Your system is giving you clear feedback about what it can and cannot tolerate, and you're finally listening to that feedback instead of overriding it with social obligation. Jung would say this is exactly how it should work. Your growing intolerance for certain social dynamics is your psyche setting boundaries that your conscious mind was never brave enough to set. Every canceled plan, every declined invitation, every time you choose an evening alone over a gathering that would leave you depleted, that's your deeper self asserting its needs. And the guilt you feel about it is just the remnant of a social programming that told you your needs don't matter as much as other people's comfort. Let me address something that comes up for almost everyone going through this. The fear that you're becoming a bad person. Because the narrative around spiritual growth is supposed to be about expanding love, about becoming more compassionate, more open, more accepting. And here you are, increasingly unable to tolerate most people, getting irritated by conversations that seem meaningless, choosing solitude over community, feeling your heart close rather than open when someone launches into the kind of surface-level exchange that constitutes 90% of human social interaction. Jung would tell you that what's happening is more nuanced than your heart is closing. Your heart is actually becoming more discerning. It's learning to distinguish between genuine connection and performance of connection, between intimacy and proximity, between people who are present and people who are just physically in the room. And once your heart develops this discernment, it naturally reserves itself for the exchanges that are real and withdraws from the ones that aren't. This looks like closing from the outside. From the perspective of people who are used to your open, available, always accommodating persona, yes, you are less open, less available, less accommodating. And they experience that as loss, as rejection, sometimes as betrayal. They don't understand that you're not closing your heart, you're opening it more selectively, which means the people who do receive your openness get something far more genuine than what you were distributing broadly before. Think about this. When you were socially open to everyone, performing connection with anyone who showed up, how much of what you gave was real? How present were you actually? How much of your warmth was genuine versus reflexive? Most people going through this phase, when they're honest with themselves, admit that their previous social openness was more about fear than love. Fear of rejection, fear of being seen as cold, fear of not belonging. The warmth they radiated was often a defense mechanism. Keep everyone comfortable so no one looks too closely at what's underneath. Awakening strips that defense away, and what remains is a smaller, fiercer, more honest kind of warmth. Warmth you actually mean, connection you actually feel, presence that's actually present rather than performed. This is what Jung meant by becoming real, and real is inherently more selective than performance, because you can only be genuinely present with so many people at once. Now, let's talk about what happens on the other side of this, because you won't stay in the disliking everyone phase forever, and it's important to know what's coming. Jung observed that patients who made it through the withdrawal period, who endured the loneliness, who trusted their changing perception, who did the shadow work of examining their own projections alongside their genuine insights, eventually reached a new equilibrium. Their social world rebuilt itself, but on entirely different foundations. The new relationships that formed were characterized by something the old ones almost never had: mutual authenticity. These were connections with people who had also done some version of the internal work. People who didn't need you to perform for them and didn't perform for you. People you could sit with in silence without it being awkward, or disagree with without it becoming a crisis, or show your actual unedited self to without them flinching. These relationships tend to be fewer in number and radically deeper in quality. Where your old social world might have been 20 or 30 people you maintained contact with, your post-awakening world might be 4 or 5. But those 4 or 5 know you in a way that none of the 30 ever did, because masks aren't part of the equation. There's no performance to maintain, no persona to project, no social contract to uphold. Just two people being honest with each other about who they are. And that honesty creates a quality of connection that most people have never actually experienced, which is why they don't know to miss it. Jung also observed something important about how individuated people relate to the broader social world: the strangers, acquaintances, co-workers, and casual contacts that make up the majority of human interaction. The contempt fades, the irritation softens. What replaces it is a kind of quiet clarity. You still see the performances, you still register the inauthenticity. You still recognize when someone is operating entirely from persona. But it stops bothering you the way it did during the acute phase. The reason it stops bothering you is that you've completed the shadow work around it. You've acknowledged and integrated your own performer, your own people pleaser, your own mask wearer. They're no longer parts of yourself you're rejecting. They're parts you've understood and made peace with. And once you stop rejecting those qualities in yourself, seeing them in others becomes less triggering. You can witness someone's performance with understanding rather than revulsion, because you remember what it felt like to need that performance. You remember the fear underneath it. You remember how long you lived that way yourself. This is the compassion that comes through the other side, and it's qualitatively different from the compassion you performed before awakening. That earlier compassion was often a mask itself, a way of being the good person who accepts everyone. This new compassion has teeth. It sees clearly and remains kind anyway, while still maintaining every boundary that your transformation taught you was necessary. You can care about someone without spending time with them. You can understand someone's unconsciousness without volunteering to sit in it. You can wish well for people whose company you can no longer keep. These aren't contradictions. They're what mature compassion actually looks like. Jung ultimately framed this entire process: the growing dislike, the withdrawal, the loneliness, the eventual rebuilding, as the social dimension of individuation. You can't become yourself while still embedded in a social matrix that requires you to be someone else. The dislike you feel isn't a flaw in your awakening. It's the awakening doing exactly what it needs to do, separating you from the structures that kept your false self in place so that your real self has room to emerge. And the reason this gets talked about so rarely in spiritual circles is that it contradicts the popular narrative of awakening as all-encompassing love. The idea that you could wake up and like fewer people, that consciousness could make you less socially available rather than more, doesn't sell well. It doesn't fit the image of the enlightened being who radiates acceptance to everyone equally. But Jung would argue that image is itself a persona, a spiritual mask. And one of the things awakening requires you to see through. The truth is quieter and more complicated. Awakening makes you capable of deeper love than you've ever known, and simultaneously intolerant of everything that mimics love without being it. You can hold both. The capacity for profound connection and the refusal to accept shallow substitutes. The desire for genuine human contact and the willingness to go without it until the genuine version appears. The love that opens wide for the right people, and the boundary that holds firm against everything else. If you're in this phase right now, if you've been watching your social world shrink and wondering whether something is wrong with you, consider sitting with the 24 reflection exercises in our guide, True Self-Discovery. They were designed around Jung's framework for exactly this kind of inner reckoning, and they won't try to talk you out of what you're feeling. They'll help you move through it with more clarity. Click below to get it.